Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know that there will be a few others making their way in this morning. If everyone shows up, we should have pretty much this place filled out. You know, when I give this talk around suicide and self-harm, I'm reminded of the reality that our kids face. I'm reminded that they're not just dealing with academic issues, they're dealing with life issues. Between the ages of 14 and 24, roughly 80% of all mental health issues manifest. Let me say that again. Between the ages of 14 and 24, roughly 80% of all mental health issues manifest. That is, they begin. And the question is why? What is it about this time of life, this window of life, that sets the course for some kids to move into adulthood with issues around mental health? What is it about this developmentally? Perhaps it's biological in terms of unfolding. Perhaps it's cultural in terms of practices within a home. Perhaps it's a combination of both of those things or other variables. Regardless, we have kids at SAS that are struggling with suicide ideation. We've had kids who have attempted suicide at SAS. What I can say to you is that in terms of numbers, the number of kids who have attempted suicide hasn't gone up, but the number of kids who are ideating has. And part of the reason for that is because of some of the other mental health issues we're seeing around co-contributing factors like depression, like anxiety, like feeling overwhelmed with the sense of stress, like living a life out of balance. And immediately our tendency is to jump to technology and think that that's the culprit for it. I think it's more multi-determined than that, as we'll talk about this morning. There are a number of different variables that go into play in terms of affecting students' well-being and health. But what I find in my work with adolescents is that, and I've said this before if you've been to some of my parent boot camps, but it bears repeating. Adolescence is a time when kids are fundamentally trying to answer four questions. Questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Questions of origin. How did we get here? Are we a product of time plus chance? Is there a God or gods? Meaning, what's the purpose of life? How do I determine what the purpose of life is? Furthermore, how do I determine what my purpose is? So as a PACT counselor, in addition to the things that I get to do as a school psychologist, I have kids coming into me as 9th or 10th graders asking, should I take these classes to be in this profession? And I'm asking myself sometimes as I talk to these 14, 15-year-old kids, you don't know what it is you're going to even be doing 5 or 6 years from now. And yet you're putting all of this emphasis on this idea of finding that sense of meaning, that these grades, that these classes, that this university, that this degree is going to somehow give you a sense of meaning and purpose. And to some degree it does. Our professions do drive our sense of meaning and fulfillment. But in a vacuum, some of you have found this to be true the hard way. When you invest all of your efforts and energies and attitude into that goal of being, and you realize you're still left wanting, now what? Morality, how do I determine right from wrong? How do we make that judgment? How do we deal with those issues? Several years ago, there was a student here at SAS who was a senior who had his offer rescinded from his college. He had his offer rescinded because he took the AP chemistry exams when the sub was there and stole them all and was caught by the deputy principal trying to flush them down the toilet. As he was in my office, his parents were yelling at him. I can't believe you did this. I don't understand what got into you. What are you doing? What were you thinking? To which he yelled out back at his mom, you taught me this. You taught me this. You taught me the ends justify the means. You taught me whatever it takes. And then lastly, destiny. What happens when we die? Is it fade to black? Is it you go on to something else? Now our kids don't use these terms, origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, but be sure of this, when I talk with them, when you talk with them, in some way, shape, or form, they're grappling with those questions of identity. And coupled with that are those four facets. And we do this into adulthood. If we don't have these questions answered at some degree of adequacy, we move in through adulthood and we continue to wrestle with these issues. And some of your kids may be asking you some really difficult questions. And it's a lot bigger than because I said so. And now you're in a position, and they're in a position where they're trying to figure out what this all means. And I'm in this boat with you as well, having a couple kids at SAS. So as we think about this particular topic, I'm trying to figure out, how do I tug on some heartstrings, but also give you some head knowledge. The goal is not to put fear into you, but to empower you to have conversations with your kids. I'll say this several times in the course of our presentation this morning. The single greatest variable to prevent kids from harming themselves is being in caring relationships with others. Being in caring relationships with others, whether it's with your parents, friends, teachers, extracurricular club commitments, being a part of something. It is super important for us to have an affiliation with someone or something. And so as I'm thinking about some of the common trends that we see happening in culture today, I'm thinking about some of our kids who don't have a group, who don't have a place to belong. I'm thinking about some of our kids who may be struggling with issues of gender. I'm thinking about some of our kids who may be struggling with issues of competence in this high-powered competitive place known as SAS. Many of our kids, unfortunately, for better or worse, right or wrong, are defining themselves based on their GPA or whatever colleges that they happen to get into. There's a problem with that. Now, there's something to be gleaned in a good way from putting your best efforts forward and achieving your goals. But the be-all, end-all of that particular school, or the be-all, end-all of that GPA, is that really what you want? A lovely kid was in my office yesterday, and we talked for about 45 minutes. She's in 10th grade right now, and rocket science smart. Rocket science smart. She's a kid who I think is going to go on to accomplish a lot of really good things with her life, as long as, and as I said this to her several times in several different ways, as long as you don't tie your worth to your GPA. You see, she has it in her mind that she can do all things, and all things at high levels. And I said to her, what happens just hypothetically if you didn't? Because her definition of high levels, any guesses? Any guesses? Yeah, A's. Everything A. I should be able to take 3 APs, a couple ATs, and earn A's in everything. Everything. And when I can't do that, I feel bad as a person. And the issue has very little to do with intelligence and everything to do with balance. There's just too much. There's too much. These kids are taking on academic loads that are actually larger than what they're going to deal with in a given slot of time in university. I mean, think about it. When you look back on your college experience, those of you that attended college universities, you know that a full-time course load was somewhere between 12 and 17 credits. These kids are taking much more than that in the course of 2 days. But it's not just academics. In my time here at SAS, it is rare to hear from a kid that they want to harm themselves or are thinking of harming themselves in isolation. It is multi-determined. There's a lot of different variables associated with suicide. And I'll share some of those with you. The goal is not to overwhelm you with data, but rather to try to create context for understanding. But academics in a vacuum, it's rare to see that with kids. In my time here at SAS, I've had kids who tried to harm themselves because their parents were abusive. I've had kids who've tried to harm themselves because they've gotten to a broken relationship. I've had kids who've tried to harm themselves because they've been clinically depressed and they can't see a way out. I've had kids who've tried to harm themselves because their parents were having to move and they didn't want to leave. I've had kids who wanted to harm themselves because they got into a fight with some of their good friends, didn't make it onto a particular team. But rarely do we find this happening in isolation around one particular variable. There's usually a number of different pieces that play into that. And so as we think about this issue of suicide, one of the reasons that we meet with students and talk about this, which we do, one of the reasons we meet with parents to talk about this, which we do, one of the reasons we meet with faculty and talk about this, which I will next week, is because we want to create a context of understanding and have a lot of eyes on what's happening with our kids. Some of the estimates are roughly 80% of kids who commit suicide, their parents had no knowledge. They didn't see the signs. But in hindsight, looking back on it, they find the things that suggest to them, wow, there was something there. You'll see that today in one of the videos that I'll share with you. Sometimes with our kids, the goal isn't to cure them, it's to keep them safe for now. What do we need to do to keep you safe today? What do we need to do to keep you safe tomorrow? We're not going to solve this in one night. We're not going to solve this in 1 week. Some of these kids are stretching out their adolescence, trying to figure things out. And in the course of that, our challenge and our charge is to help keep them safe for now. Suicide has moved into second place as a primary cause of death among persons aged 10 to 24. This number, 90 minutes, reflects the life of a teenager being taken in the United States every 90 minutes. Every 90 minutes. Anybody know the number one cause of death among adolescents? Just as a side. Excuse me.
Accidents?
Accidents, yeah. Accidents. Yeah. It used to be it used to be accidents, homicide, suicide, cancers. Suicide has now replaced that. By the estimates in the US, it's up some 30% since we started gauging and understanding what's happening with our kids. Certainly we also see an uptick in the amount of anxiety that kids are reporting. Anxiety, depression, mental health issues are a contributing factor to kids who want to harm themselves. Excuse me. As we look at some of these stats, it kind of puts things into perspective for us in terms of what's happening. Roughly 80% of all suicides are committed by males. And of that roughly 80%, close to 70% are Caucasian males. It's the method of lethality that males use versus females that contributes to their suicide. But I want to debunk a common misunderstanding. Sometimes we think that a kid, if they were really, really serious about harming themselves, they would have chosen a really, really high-level method of lethality. That's not our focus. Our focus is the intention. The intention was to kill themselves. Whether they take pills, whether they try to hang themselves, whether they use a firearm, it's the method of lethality that contributes to these kids ultimately taking their life. In roughly 50% of the cases where males have committed suicide, they've had alcohol in their system. Alcohol is a central nervous system suppressant. When we drink, we don't think. It lowers our inhibitions. For these young males who are killing themselves at a rate upwards of 5 times higher than females, it's quite disturbing. I apologize for this, folks. I'm on the backside of a cold here, but I'm going to get through it. Every face has a story. I remember Nick, not his real name. He was a student who graduated from SAS about 6 years ago. I've lost track of him since then. But when he was here as a senior, he was struggling with depression. Not only was he struggling with depression, he was struggling with an abusive home. His father was an alcoholic and beat him. And he transferred in as a sophomore. He didn't connect with other kids, but he was too embarrassed to tell them why he didn't want to go out drinking with them. He had made the choice because of what he had seen in his own family, that he didn't want alcohol to be part of his world. But by isolating himself from his peers, it caused only further problems for him. A new kid coming into SAS, not connecting with high school students, going home to an abusive situation. For his 2 years remaining at SAS, he struggled greatly with suicide ideation. He struggled with trying to figure out, how am I going to get through this? And his only hope, he said several times to me, was graduating, getting out, getting away, getting away. He did make it to graduation. He went off to university, and I don't know what's happened to him since. My hope is that he's found a way to move his life forward and get the supports and structures that he needs at university. You know, at SAS we have this beautiful facility, beautiful school, wealthy community, but you just scratch a little bit below the surface, and you know what you see? Real kids with real families dealing with real issues. And the challenge we face is being real, trying to figure out how to deal with this. So my question to you this morning, why is this topic so uncomfortable for us to talk about? I want to open it up to you folks. Why is this so difficult for us to talk about?
It's scary.
Yeah, what's scary about it?
It's a scary thing that it can happen to you. Your kids.
Yeah, what else?
Sometimes I worry about that actually maybe enhance it because like reminding them, so trying to avoiding maybe reduce it.
Yeah, talking about it actually leads to putting ideas into kids' mind.
Right.
Yeah. We'll take that on in just a little bit. What else? Yeah.
When it happens, it's our fault.
Yeah, this idea of blame.
Yeah.
Yeah. I often fear, candidly speaking, that in the event of a student dying of, say, alcohol poisoning, we would have several hundred parents in this room asking, what is the school doing? I.e., what are people like me doing to try to help prevent this? There's certainly going to be a lot of questions to be asked about this particular topic. But on this issue of whether or not we're planting seeds of doubt with our kids around suicide, make no mistake, you're not. Most of your kids, if not all of our kids, think about their place in the world at some point. And they're asking themselves, why am I here? What would it be like if I wasn't here? Now, it doesn't mean that they're ideating, that is planning, preparing, carrying through, but it does mean that they're thinking about their existence. And so talking about suicide doesn't actually promote suicide. It actually creates a context for understanding that what you're thinking or feeling isn't so aberrant or abnormal that others haven't gone through similar kinds of experiences. Where it does become aberrant, where it does become a concern, where it does become something we need to deal with is when that person has reached that point of actually planning out, wanting to carry through, and is prepared to do that. Oftentimes what I hear from kids who've attempted suicide, and any given year here at SAS we have roughly 12 kids, 13 kids who've attempted suicide. Most of those, a year. Again, it's the second leading cause of death among adolescents. We're not immune to this because of our socioeconomic status. We have a little less likelihood based on the data in terms of access to firearms, in terms of access to vehicles, but we have kids who attempt. Oftentimes, when we have these kids who attempt, 3 out of 4 will get up and go to school the next morning. They're not seeking out help or support. They don't talk to kids about it. Sometimes they come to us, a friend often will, and express some concern that they have about a peer that is expressing some of these symptoms and signs that I'll share with you this morning. And there's enough of a concern where we try to reach out and get help for that kid. It is rare where a student will come into our office and say, hey, I'm thinking of killing myself. It's a rare thing. Quite often, it's their peers that are coming in to speak with us. Quite often, it's the parents who are coming in to talk to us, and they say, hey, things just aren't right. Something's out of sync here. And so this communication, this triangle between the school, parents, kids, is a really important one for us to try to raise that awareness. As I said to you earlier, the method of lethality, some of those accessible means aren't available here. In my time here at SAS, the majority of the kids who've attempted have been female. And it's oftentimes through the use of medications that they find or self-inflicted injuries. As you may or may not be aware, in Singapore it's illegal to attempt suicide. You can be arrested for that. We've had a student who a few years ago tried to commit suicide in a public way and was incarcerated and placed in a detention cell. So it's not something that the Singapore government looks upon with, I would say, the greatest care, but I think they're trying to figure out ways that they can help support these people but aren't quite sure how to deal with this expat population. The data that I had from 2014 looking at this topic, let me see if I can pull this out for you here. On Singapore, get my spectacles on. This is from 2014, these are the latest stats I could find. There were 1,000 suicide attempts reported in Singapore. There were 415 suicide deaths, and of that percent, or of that number, 70% were male. 70% were male. I think one of the things, again, that makes us uncomfortable about this topic is we don't quite know how to broach it with our kids. The last couple years on Netflix, there were a series of videos that were put out with the title 13 Reasons Why. And has anyone seen these video series? 13 Reasons Why? The premise of the story is there's a girl by the name of Hannah who commits suicide. And she has a friend, a close friend by the name of Clay. And she puts together these tapes, 13 tapes. And these tapes talk about why she committed suicide and the influence other people had on her committing suicide. The problem and the positive about this are twofold. 13 Reasons highlighted the trauma that kids often go through. But it also demonstrated that parents don't really understand fully what's happening in the life of their kids. It also demonstrated that the counselor didn't follow through with a lot of the things that he had indicated he was going to follow through with. And this brings us to a really interesting point as a school. Our primary area where we are going to violate confidentiality is if we believe a student is an imminent threat to themselves or others. If we have that feeling, that belief, we're going to violate our relationship contract with that kid in order to get them the help that they need, even if it means going forward, they no longer want to work with us. That we're willing to take that risk. In fact, sometimes when I meet with kids, they're really reluctant to want to share who the kid's name is because they know it's going to get back to them and they know they're going to possibly get in trouble by their friend. And what I have to oftentimes try to help them understand is that your friend is not well. And you may have to be willing to risk the friendship in order to save the life. Again, the goal is what do we need to do to keep this young person safe for now? Some of the things that the episode series didn't get so well. They took a complex issue and they tried to place the blame on other people for it, instead of trying to help that young person recognize some of the things that were happening with their own heart and head. But again, remember, when we talk about this mental health issue around suicide, it's very common for people who have diagnosed medical conditions or psychiatric conditions to commit suicide. The most common is depression. Roughly 15 to 30% of those identified as having clinical depression have attempted suicide at some point in their life, or will attempt suicide at some point in their life. So when we have kids who are struggling with depression, it's a really important piece for us to understand, how are you coping? What are you doing to deal with that? I had a student a couple weeks ago who had a suicide attempt. And I was working with the counselor that was supporting this young person. And I made a call to a psychiatrist here in Singapore to try to get them some help to do an assessment. Anytime we have a kid who has had a suicide attempt at SAS, part of the work that we do to ensure that that student is safe to return to SAS is we consult with a psychiatrist outside of school. Sometimes that psychiatrist prescribes medications in addition to ongoing counseling supports that that student will need. Sometimes they give us an assessment that this student is not ready to return yet because they have questions or concerns about their mental health status. But what we're trying to do is bring in as many experts as we can to support that young person. My go-to person, the guy that I usually call, the psychiatrist, wasn't available initially. And so I made some inquiries to look for other help and support. This was March 5th when I made the call to this clinic. They said the earliest they could get me in was April 5th. April 5th. The ratios for child psychs here in Singapore is roughly 1 to 30,000. 1 to 30,000. And they said to me, if this child comes in to see us, we're going to give them medication. And I said, wait a second, you haven't even met the child yet. They may not need medication, but that's primarily what we do. We medicate and then we farm out for counseling support. Now again, it's not a slam against Singapore. They're trying to do what they can to support kids as best they can. There are realities that they face. So that kid coming back into SAS, we had to make sure that there was a plan of support in place for them to come back into school, to figure out how do we help keep them safe for now. When we think about these risk factors associated with suicide, I don't want you to think of this in terms of an isolated variable. What I want you to think about this is something that's multidimensional. There's a lot of different pieces that go into the life of a young person. This is called the overlap theory. And what this means is that there's a couple different areas that we want to take a look at when a person may be suicidal. And this will take us into this next part of our talk that's going to talk a little bit about what are some of these signs, what are some of these things that we need to be aware of. In terms of behavioral health issues, roughly, as I mentioned earlier, depression is the largest factor that's associated with kids who want to take their life. As I said to you though earlier, anxiety is also on the rise. By the way, what's the only common emotion that males typically can demonstrate? Anger, yeah, anger, right? So how do you see a teenage boy as depressed? Anger. It's two sides of a coin often. So for these boys that are habitually angry at the world, raging against the machine, oftentimes what I note for them is that they're struggling with depression. But it doesn't show itself the way it might show itself with females. Those who've had a history of suicide attempts, for example, those who committed suicide successfully, often it's not their first attempt. Roughly 25 to 33% of all suicides have had previous suicide attempts prior to that. So here's an example. We got a kid who's tried to harm themselves 2 weeks before interim semester. We're getting ready to go on an airplane to a foreign country, travel away. Fortunately, this young person identified, or parents identified, or students identified that they were an imminent risk to themselves or others. Good news, we get them the help and support they need. Bad news, we know that the likelihood of another attempt within the next 6 to 8 weeks is extremely high. Interim semester is next week. What do we do? Well, our policy here, our practice here, is that that student is not going to be allowed to go on that interim semester trip. It's not meant to be punitive. That student certainly will feel that it's punitive because here I either self-identified or I'm reaching out for help and the school is doing this to me. I remember sitting in a meeting several years ago with a parent who was irate that my child identified they needed help and this is how you're treating them. And we had to weigh this in the context of all of these other pieces, recognizing the elevated risk for this student, recognizing there were 2 sponsors on this trip that was going to be in a foreign country with 19 other kids, and the help and support wasn't going to be there for that child. Very difficult conversation to have, but one that we know we need to make a call on in terms of making sure that these kids are safe and have the support that they need. So sometimes when we have to have these hard conversations, it's just that. It's really hard and it's really painful. And as we talk about in the event of a suicide, what we do on campus and what we don't do on campus is because of the data and what we understand about how these kids are picking up different things from one another. A common term that we might use to describe that is called contagion. It's not atypical to see rates of suicide go up among the general population when people in popular media commit suicide. Robin Williams is an example of this. When his suicide death happened, there was a spike in suicides as we looked at the data. Same is true among the general population with adolescents. A fourth of the teens who committed suicide, roughly a fourth of them, had alcohol in their system at some point. So alcohol is a contributing drug. Family characteristics in terms of what's happening with parenting practices. What we're finding is that increasingly in dysfunctional families, in situations where kids haven't been taught the skills to deal with and cope with the pain, the trauma, the issues that they're going through, it's not uncommon for these kids to cluster together in like-minded groups. You know, there are all kinds of support groups online. Whatever sort of deviant behavior or deviation of a behavior that a person has, a teenager, in terms of identity, they're going to find a group to affiliate with online. They're going to find a sense of community online. I remember a couple years ago working with kids. I was working with 3 students. They were all friends who were struggling with SI, self-injury, self-harm. By the way, just as a side, kids who cut generally speaking, it's not about suicide. It's about coping. The desire is to live, but the desire is also to manage pain that they're going through. So when we have kids who are struggling with SI, it's freaky, but it doesn't freak us out in that we don't think that they're an imminent threat to harming themselves as much as they are trying to manage and cope with some sort of pain. In those sorts of situations, we certainly want to get parents involved to help out, but we also want to help them understand in most cases, this isn't about killing. This is about coping. This is about a desire to want to live, but not sure how to deal with that pain and process what's happening with them. So there's a lot of different events that are happening with these kids that draw together the different factors. But even with these, sometimes we miss the signs.
This is Suicide Prevention Month, designed to raise awareness of an epidemic. Every 90 minutes, someone between the ages of 15 and 24 takes his or her life. The young woman you're about to meet tonight was 17. Her parents share Alexandra's story with Jim Axelrod in our continuing series, Eye on America.
Tonight was beautiful. I saw the moon, I saw the stars.
The home video will look so familiar to so many parents. The sweet little girl singing and dancing her way to her teen years, where she's recognized for achieving outside the home
And please consider me for the National Honor Society.
and thoroughly cherished inside.
Like, this was awesome, Alexandra. She was such a happy girl.
Happy birthday to you.
And so motivated and so just full of life.
Dear Alexandra.
But familiar will turn to terrifying when parents hear the whole story of Alexandra Valores. Just weeks after a family ski vacation, give a smile, this 17-year-old high school junior, straight-A student, class officer, and robotics whiz
Not too bad.
made her bed, tidied her room, and walked to a highway overpass in Grafton, Massachusetts.
I leaned over the embankment and looked down and I saw her.
Dean Valores, Alexandra's father.
I was just hoping for warmth. Do you know what I mean? But there was no warmth. It was done. Then all the cars kept driving by. My daughter's on the side of the road. Nobody saw this. And she's cold.
Nearby, Dean and his wife Alicia found 2 journals in their daughter's belongings.
There was just so much joy in everything she did. And it doesn't match what was in that journal.
200 pages of self-loathing and despair.
You were broken.
You were a burden. You were lazy. You were a failure.
She was a highly motivated achiever.
But that's how she felt inside.
Such a sharp and confusing contrast to who they thought was their happy oldest child, strumming her way through adolescence and still talking to her parents.
You're having all these great conversations.
Great conversations. It just doesn't seem possible, but it's what reality was. Because it's written right here.
With teen suicide at a 40-year high for young women Alexandra's age, and now the second leading cause of death for 15 to 24-year-olds of both sexes, it is this disconnect that most haunts Dean and Alicia Valores. The girl who seemed to love him last November when her father took her to a concert went home and wrote, "I hated him. I hate myself for that."
The journal is a chronicle of deterioration. I think
Yeah,
so.
I'd say so.
I think so.
Which is why they're taking this pain public that most keep private, headlining suicide prevention walks, giving in-depth interviews about their daughter's death.
The hurt, the sadness is evolving. And now there's this thing called living. So then I'm a good father, a good husband, and a good person.
They hope that in sharing the story of their daughter, maybe another family will be spared this trauma.
What will I miss by dying tonight? The possibility of getting better.
There's a lot of other kids out there that are like her, that are high achievers, that are balancing a lot. That's what makes her very relatable, and why maybe it's affecting people, and why they're listening is because I have a child like this too.
And in the pain of what Alex wrote to her parents in her final entry hours before she took her life, "Don't blame yourselves for not seeing warning signs," is also what the Valores family hopes to salvage from her death. Some meaning for others.
There's so many emails.
In June, the morning after an interview was published, they found this note on their doorstep.
What you have said in Alexandra's article truly changed my life. Knowing that families are talking to their kids about their mental health, it lets me know that she didn't die in vain. She's having such a huge impact. And that feels really good.
It's hard to talk about and process.
There could be any number of SAS kids that profile. And loving parents, supportive family, and yet there were signs that they didn't see, things that they had missed. Our hope in sharing this information with you this morning is that you would be a bit more cognizant of what's happening in the hearts and minds of your young kids to try to recognize what's going on. The hard thing about adolescents is they want to be incredibly private. They don't want you in their world as much as you would like to be in it. And so we got to figure out different ways to make an impact and inroads into their world. And some of that is having good connections with peers. Some of that is good connections with extended family, if you have those folks available. Some of that is coaches and other mentors who can provide that level of support. Roughly 10 to 15% of kids who commit suicide leave a note. That note typically contains 3 facets to it. It's usually addressed to someone, it gives a reason, and it expresses their care. The notes sometimes sound like this. This was a note of a kid who wanted to kill himself at SAS. Fortunately, he didn't, but he wrote the notes. Fortunately, his helper found the notes. Fortunately, his helper told the dad. Fortunately, the dad contacted the school. Fortunately, we were able to get the kid the support they needed and the help, but not before he wrote these notes. If your child has written a suicide note, the intention to kill, to self-harm, is at an extremely high level. They need immediate support, immediate care. Hey, I did it. I killed myself. I finally got the balls to. Look, there's no mistake, I effed up. I lied, I cheated, I stole, but the one mistake I didn't make was dating, and then he lists the girl. She gets all my stuff. As for a funeral, send an email and see who comes. There are only a few people I want to talk to, and then he lists those friends that he'd want to have spoken to, and he lists his teachers as well. And then he talks about his girlfriend and says, she's what kept me alive these last 6 months. I hope she'll forgive me now. Each person who knew me, I loved you all. You brought light to my world and gave me purpose. Bye, and love you. Then he wrote a note to his brother, and then he wrote a note to his sister, and then he wrote a note to his dad. This young man is still alive. He's found his place. He's finding himself. He's figuring things out. But some of these kids, they really struggle with this. They struggle with trying to be able to make their way into this world and figure out where their sense of worth and purpose come from. I hope that you're communicating that message often to your kids about where their purpose, meaning, worth come from. It isn't that they're going to necessarily believe you as much as they might need to just be affirmed again and again and again, where you're using a measuring stick for determining their worth and their purpose. As I said earlier, at SAS and in schools in general, if we have kids who have committed suicide, what we try to do is focus on how we can support those immediately involved in the situation. So if we had a suicide attempt, or if we had a successful suicide, what we would do is we would take a look at who are those in geographic proximity of that young person, that is, who was there, who saw it, who needs that help and triage and support. How can we provide that safety for those kids? So we may go to that particular student's classes that they had, their schedule, and follow and communicate with those kids who are in that class what we know, what happened. Usually we have a stand-up meeting in the morning. We'll have a meeting at the end of the day. We'll do that through the course of at minimum a week. We set up a triage center in our counseling office to try to provide supports for other kids. We make sure that we're doing the best job that we can to take into account some of these cluster possibilities. Because we know that we have other kids who have made attempts, and when they hear of an attempt, it could affect their mental state and their wellness also. We don't allow, for example, memorial services on campus or setting up a shrine, if you will, by a kid's locker. It's not that we don't care about the kid, of course we do. It's that we don't want to create this context in a school setting where there's some kind of glorification that's happening around the suicide. And folks that don't know that or understand that, they can be really angry and upset with that. It's somehow as if the school doesn't care, or we're not taking time to remember their child. We want to have memorial services, but we want to have SAS and schools in general be a place where we celebrate life. Be a place where we celebrate being able to have the supports and structures in place. But make no mistake, when there are memorial services or there are times when we need to come together as a community around suicide ideation or harm, we certainly do that. Quite often in the community, we don't hear about these things because they're generally private matters when we have kids who are struggling with suicide ideation and self-harm. We want to have a level of confidentiality, but what I want you to know, we're not immune to these issues simply because of where we're located. So let's talk about some of these signs. What are some of the things that we need to be aware of in terms of immediate help, kind of caution or concern? And then what are some of those protective factors that we can put in place to help support kids? And generally speaking, when we think of these imminent warning signs, this is where everything else stops, by the way. When we have kids who are suicidal and they're meeting some of these criteria, everything stops. I got a test I need to get. I got these papers I need to finish. I got to do this. No, everything stops. When it comes to your child and grades, we can do anything. We're going to cancel that presentation. You know, we're not taking that test right now. Because our goal is, what do we need to do to keep this child safe for now? What do we need to do to make sure that if this perhaps is a variable, this quiz, test, project, grade, is getting in the way of you being alive, we're going to remove that variable so that you don't have to deal with that. This isn't something that gets reported to a college or university. It doesn't go on a transcript. You don't make a phone call to the prospective school that you're attending. These aren't things that we do, but what we do want to do is to remove all of those obstacles that this kid sees is getting in the way of them potentially harming themselves. So the warning signs. Ideation. Are they thinking about planning? Substance use. Are they using drugs as a means to medicate? And again, as I mentioned earlier, the most common drug that's used by teenagers is alcohol here at SAS. We have some kids functionally in our school. Sadly, they would meet the diagnostic criteria of having a dependency issue when it comes to this substance. Purposelessness, trapped, hopeless, withdrawal, recklessness, mood changes, anxiety. These are the kinds of warning signs in clusters that we look at to determine whether or not this kid needs imminent help. If you have a child that is demonstrating or manifesting any of these signs, and you can point out 4 or 5 of these together, it's a pretty good sign that you may want to reach out to their counselor. It's a pretty good sign that you may want to reach out to their teachers to kind of confirm or debunk what it is that you might be noting with your kids. In isolation, as I mentioned to you earlier, we can't just take one of these variables and say, if you're a kid who engages in SI, you're going to commit suicide. That's rarely the case. But that in conjunction with a whole host of other things certainly can contribute to that. Some of these other risk factors. Kids who don't quite know how to deal with relationship issues. Kids who use a drug like alcohol to medicate relationship issues. Let me just go on a tangent on this for a little bit because it's kind of a pet peeve of mine in terms of alcohol and culture. What happens when kids drink alcohol as a means of coping, when they're 14 years old, 15 years old, 16 years old, 17 years old, 18 years old, is it stunts their social emotional growth. Instead of working through the difficulty of trying to figure out how to fit in, how to belong, how to deal with my parents who I'm pissed with, how to get over that broken up relationship, they medicate using a drug. And it stunts their social emotional growth. That's why the kids that we primarily see abusing alcohol in adolescence are the ones that become the alcoholics in adulthood. It is a rare, rare case where you will find an alcoholic that did not begin drinking during adolescence. Very rare, almost extremely rare. So when we think about kids using these kinds of drugs as a means of medicating, my concern is twofold. One, what they're trying to medicate, and two, how do we help them get the tools to deal with that pain and that trauma in healthy sorts of ways going forward. Family members, difficulties with parents, issues around bullying, academic pressures, physical issues. One of our kids recently had found out that they were diagnosed with a medical condition that's going to stick with them the rest of their life. Every day, I'm dependent on this substance to live. Now what? How am I going to deal with this? And for this young person, they struggled with trying to make sense of this, to the point where, real quickly, they got to a place where they self-harmed. Fortunately, we were able to get that young person the support and care that they need, but this was just a little while ago. So we know that in the course of these next several weeks and months, this young person is going to need help and support adjusting to their new normal, their new reality. And I can assure you, they're asking themselves, why me? Why am I the one that has this? I'm the good student. Why couldn't it be? I was doing everything. Why doesn't anybody else have it? So they're going to have to grapple through this and try to figure out how to handle these sorts of things.
I have my ups and downs, just like anybody else.
Maybe more than anybody else.
I can be hard to figure out.
And I like my privacy.
I don't want you looking over my shoulder all the time.
But you know your kid better than anybody else. And if you think he's acting different than usual,
Acting really down, crying all the time for no good reason,
or getting really mad, not able to sleep, or sleeping too much,
Shutting her friends out or giving her stuff away.
acting reckless, drinking, using drugs, staying out late,
Suddenly not doing stuff he used to love.
or doing stuff that's just not like him.
it might be nothing to worry about. It might just be high school.
Or it might be something more. He might be depressed. Not just feeling down, really depressed.
It might be that your kid is thinking about killing himself.
It happens. More than you think. More than it should.
And people say, I had no idea.
I thought it was just a phase he was going through.
I never thought she'd do it.
I wish he'd come to me.
I wish he'd said something.
I wish I'd said something.
When it's too late. So if you think your kid's acting different, if she seems like a different person, say something.
Say, what's wrong? How can I help?
And ask straight out. Are you thinking about killing yourself? It doesn't hurt to ask. In fact, it helps.
When people are thinking about killing themselves, they want somebody to ask.
They want somebody to care.
Maybe you're afraid you'll make it worse if you ask. Like, you'll put the idea in their head.
Believe me, it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't hurt to ask. In fact, the best way to keep a teenager from killing herself is to ask. Are you thinking about killing yourself?
And what if they say yes?
Or maybe.
Or sometimes,
Well, here's what you don't say.
That's crazy.
Don't be such a drama
you're
queen.
making too much of this.
That boy's not worth killing yourself over. That's not going to solve anything.
You're just trying to get attention.
You're not going to kill yourself.
What you do say is,
I'm sorry you're feeling so bad. How can I help? We'll get through this together.
Let's keep you safe.
A lot of people think about killing themselves. Adults and kids.
most of them never tried, but some of them do. So if your kid says,
I'd be better off dead. I can't live with this.
I'm gonna kill myself,
Take her seriously. Find someone she can talk to about it. Someone who knows how to help.
Sometimes kids want to kill themselves because something happened. A breakup, a failure. But sometimes it goes deeper, and it's not going to go away by itself. Get some help. Talk to your doctor.
Or a counselor at school.
Or your minister.
but don't just let it drop.
And make sure that your kid always has someone to turn to. Someone he trusts. Make a list together, right then. 3, 4, 5 names.
Put a suicide hotline number on there too.
Have him keep that list in his wallet, so he always knows where to turn.
Be sure your home is safe. If you have pills she could use to hurt herself, lock them up.
If you have a gun, don't just lock it up. Get it out of the house. Bullets, too.
And one more thing. If you think your kid might be about to hurt himself, don't leave him alone.
Take him to the emergency room.
Call 911 if you have to.
We all have our ups and downs, but sometimes it's more than that.
If you think something's wrong, the only way to find out is to ask. Ask straight out. Are you thinking about killing yourself?
Don't wait until you're sure. Trust your gut.
because it never hurts to ask.
And it can make a big difference. All the difference. In your kid's life.
As we think about some of the misinformation out there around kids who are thinking about killing themselves, one of the things that I hope you'll take away from this talk is that it's okay to ask that question. You know, in my office, it's not uncommon as I work with kids, and they're describing a series of not so great events that have happened, culminating in them being in the office feeling depressed or sad. And this happens on a regular basis for this particular kid. I might say to them something like, man, there's a lot of stuff going on here. You know, sometimes people who are feeling the way you do think about killing themselves. Has that crossed your mind at all? Are you thinking about that? And sometimes they'll break down and say, yeah, I actually am. And sometimes they'll say, no, I'll never do that. That's not where I'm going. I'm just in a really dark place right now. And I say to them things like, well, what's your plan? Like, not what's your plan to harm yourself, but what's your plan to keep yourself safe? I mean, given all of the stuff that you're describing, the negative things, how is it that you're coping with this? I had a really supportive dad. He's my rock, and I wouldn't want to disappoint him by harming myself. But I just need someone to talk to. I just need to work through some of these different things that I'm going through. So we know some of these protective factors for our kids, certainly schools and families. Kids who perform well academically. And when I say well, I don't mean earning A's, I mean a sense of competence. Sometimes I have parents ask me, how can I help my kid be happy? Can you help me help my kid be happy? To which I say, no, I can't. Happiness isn't a place. We come and go as we go through life. But I can tell you this, for our kids, for your kids, when it comes to academics, oftentimes their sense of happiness is directly proportional to their sense of competence. I can do. And so to take a kid like this young lady I was talking about earlier, brilliant kid, and put her in way over her head and say, perform, and she can't perform at high levels across everything, suddenly she no longer feels competent. And it never was a function of intelligence, it was always a function of balance. So as I go back and forth with her, I'm trying to help her understand, look, you can choose to do all these things, but there's a potential cost here. How do we weigh that cost in the midst of all of the other stuff going on? So we have this little conversation called the can, should, cost equation. Like, can you take these classes? Should you take these classes given the cost that could potentially be there for you? And that may be the conversation that you have with your kids as you think about scheduling for this next year. Scheduling's opened up. Kids can start picking their classes. I can guarantee you there's going to be competition. Well, you're taking 4 APs. I should take 5 and 2 ATs. Every kid is different. If they haven't demonstrated you their ability to be able to control their emotions, balance their time, self-initiate, stick to certain tasks, those things are not functions of intelligence. Those things are functions of life skills that they need to learn. And then they can start to take on some of those. Or maybe they can take on 1 or 2 of those with some balance and some proportionality. Some other protective factors that it's good for your kids to know. Teach them to know that it's okay to ask for help. You know, with our son Silas, he's in 7th grade, right? And as a 7th grade typical boy, he's kind of in that grunting stage. Doesn't talk a whole lot, monosyllabic grunts, headphones on, doing his thing. But I make it a point to give him a hug, to touch, to tell him I love him. And it has nothing to do, it's like out of the norm. It's like, why isn't this associated with something, Dad? How come it's not because I did? No, I just love you. Dude, I love you. I got no other agenda than me wanting to love you. Our kids need to know that. When I talk personal defense here at the school, I often ask the kids, when was the last time your parents gave you a hug or touched you? You know how few hands go up? One of the challenges we face in that class is teaching the kids about physical contact. They don't make contact with other human beings anymore. It's a weird sort of thing. And so part of the challenge is just getting them to that point where it's actually okay to be in contact with other people. Try to encourage participation. Acknowledge their efforts. Be good listeners. Help them recognize that they're on a journey. Have something to aim at as a family. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? So what to do when your child experiences a crisis? Don't leave them alone. Don't panic. Try not to be judgmental, as we saw in that video. Validate their feelings. Reach out. Be present. Sometimes we have kids who are an imminent threat to themselves, and their parents aren't in country. What do we do in those situations? We admit them to Mount Elizabeth Hospital, and we let the parents know, sorry, we're not letting them out until you come back and get them. Because we're so concerned about this child's safety and welfare that they need to be under the care of someone. Well, can't you just, I called a neighbor and they're gonna come and pick them up, they're okay. No, we're not doing that. They're down at Mount E, we're not prepared to do that. They need that structure and support that a care provider like yourself can give. So if you want them, you need to come back and get them. What does SAS do when a child experiences suicide ideation? We try to assess the magnitude of it. That is, we have conversations with the kid to try to determine how severe the threat is. We make contact with the parents if we feel it's an imminent threat. We work with their teachers. We help the kid craft the narrative. Like for example, we might have a student that's out of class 3 or 4 days, and they want to have a measure of confidentiality with their teachers to not know or their peers. I said, okay, let's sit down and figure out what do we want to say. How about I was off sick? Yeah, technically, okay, yeah, that'll work. I wasn't feeling well. We'll work a plan. Quizzes, tests, projects. I need you to understand everything stops. Everything stops. We can move things around. We can do whatever it is that we need to do to make sure that that kid is safe. And if they're feeling somehow pressured because of academics, we can remove that problem for them so that we can focus on getting them well and keeping them safe for now. What do we do around the issue of suicide ideation and suicide issues with students? We have a crisis response team here at SAS. We have meetings, we have trainings. We raise awareness of this, presentations like this. We work with your students, whether it's in our student boot camp sessions, health courses, one-on-one counseling sessions. We're trying to be proactive and intentional about finding these kids who may be an imminent threat to themselves and creating the structure to help have them have the support. As I said to you at the start of this talk, and as I conclude this with a short video, sometimes the challenge isn't fixing kids as much as it is keeping them safe for now. And that keeping them safe for now might be a day. How do we get through tomorrow? How do we get through the rest of this week? How do we get through the weekend? What do we need to do for 2 weeks out? And in the in-between time, the hope is with support, structure, counseling, medication if necessary, this kid is going to be able to get themselves to a better place where they're not immediately contemplating harming themselves. This video is a good summary of this. I'll close with this and I'll take some questions.
I remember when my father asked me to stay up all night to watch fireflies. I didn't want to, but he was right. It was the most magical thing I'd seen. My mother asked me to stay patient until the chickens got here. I just wanted to pull them out of their eggs and play. I was so glad I waited. This kid I knew asked me to stay on his team. We lost the game, but he became my best friend. And when I became a teenager, everyone kept telling me to stay. Stay focused, stay out of trouble, stay faithful. And all I could think of was the stress, the pressure, the expectations. Things I used to be excited about now seem nothing like I'd imagined. Pointless, heavy. And then people asked, "How are you?" And I said, "Fine." And people said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And I said, "No." I tried to smile and hide my darkness. I remember waking up on my 17th birthday, wanting to end my life. Because I felt so much pain. Because I felt nothing. So I decided to tell others how I feel. Bring everything hidden into the light. Because I knew one of them could help. I remember my dad holding me. My mom and my sister. Now they ask me to stay around for another moment, for another agonizing week, month, even if I couldn't see that tomorrow will get better. And I realized that somewhere in between my new, dark existence and all those beautiful moments that I've experienced in the past, I forgot something. I didn't have to stay alone. The pain doesn't fully go away. It still takes many endless conversations, therapy, prayers, medication. But as time goes on, I choose to stay hopeful. I choose to stay. To experience small, simple things I love. To see new places, meet new people. To discover who I am. To be surprised. To be loved. You can choose to stay too.
As we think about our kids, I recognize that we can't fix all of their issues in one day. They're growing, they're developing, they're changing. But what do we need to do to keep them safe for now? What do we need to do to help them stay? These are tough, tough times to be a teenager. And these are even tougher times, I would argue, to be a parent. You're competing against so many different things in this world. But one of the things I can tell you your kids need is you. They need your input, they need your love, they need your guidance, and they need to know that you're the rock for them. And so I encourage you to continue or start those conversations with your kids, helping them recognize where their worth and their value and their purpose comes from in your eyes. It's not about GPAs, it's not about grades, it's not about what college they're going to go to. It's about loving them for where they're at, who they are, recognizing that they're not done. You know, our kids are on this path of coming to know themselves, growing to like themselves, and then ultimately finding satisfaction in being themselves. And you play a big role in that. So I encourage you to continue to stay engaged with your kids and be intentional about your parenting. Thank you for your time this morning.
I haven't seen the Alexander tapes. Should have had a glimpse there. It seemed very schizophrenic in the sense of showing someone who, on the outside, showed your son, appeared to show your son, and yet personality. So that's the impression. I mean, is that just pointing out that what can be difficult to assess?
Yeah, so the question was, it seemed like there was a split personality with Alexandra in terms of what was going on with her. What I would say to you is what I started out talking about, mental health issues. Clearly, as we look through her journal, there was something off in terms of how she perceived herself and where her worth and value were coming from. Now, whether or not that's attributed to depression, anxiety, or some other type of mental health issue, I'm not sure. But what's clear is that there was a disconnect. What's clear is that people missed the signs. And had she had someone be able to speak truth into her heart about her basis for her worth and purpose, perhaps she would still be here today. And this isn't to heap any guilt on her parents. Her story could be any of our stories. You just don't know. You don't see the signs. As I mentioned to you earlier, less than 20% of these kids leave notes. It's even more difficult to find those signs. But having this kind of triangulated approach with peers, with school, with what you're seeing at home, the hope, the belief, the intention is that we're going to be able to help these young people to be safe. But 80% of mental health issues, 14 to 24, goes back to this issue of, I believe, identity, purpose, worth, meaning. Where's that coming from? And oftentimes what happens is these kids don't answer that question as much as they try to put things into that equation. Does this work? Sports. Does this work? Grades. Does this work? Appearance. Does this work? and on it goes. And until they find that combination that works for them, I think it can be somewhat daunting. A few other questions? Yes.
Just in terms of that video, because I think it's very disturbing, I think for a lot of us, because we see our kids and
Yeah.
see that.
Yeah.
As a parent, if that was my kid, were they able to pinpoint, what was it that they missed? Because they are obviously very engaged, very loving, very, you know, so that's the question as a parent.
And I don't know, I have
Was
to.
they able to determine that?
Yeah, so in those 2 books, you saw different things that she had written. Clearly, there was a lot of negative, deep things there, and why that wasn't brought out, what those potential signs. I'm confident that the parents, in retrospect, went through their mind and saw hundreds of things, but they just didn't put the pieces together at the time, right? And that's the hard part for us. In hindsight, yes, it's 20.
I mean, you're not, you know, most of them have journals. You're not going to read the journal. Is that the only option you have? Do you know what I'm saying? That doesn't
Yeah. I know what you're saying. What I think the options that we have is to try as best we can to stay connected with our kids, to help them understand where we want them to know where their worth and purpose comes from, to talk with their teachers if we have concerns about how they're dealing with the world socially, emotionally. If they have coaches, have conversations with them. You know, with my own children, I'm thinking to myself, knowing I don't have an extended community of family here, who are these caregivers that I can put into their world that are going to speak the same truths that we believe as a family, that they can hear it from someone else than dad. Because I might be the psychologist here, but at home I'm just this old dude that wears glasses now. It's like they need to hear from their teacher. They need to hear from their coach. They need to hear from some other caring adult in the community the same sorts of things. And I think as an international community, this is one of the perennial struggles that we have, is how do we form community in this context? We may have to orchestrate it, and so we do. We put out clubs, we tell our kids they have to be involved in extracurriculars, we try to arrange things with different coaches or functions. I think the more we're intentional about this, the less likely our kids are to harm, but it doesn't mitigate all factors. If a kid is intentional on harming themselves, it can be very difficult to try to get that person help. But one of the things I want to reemphasize is that when a kid is in that state of mind, they're not in a healthy mental place. What I need you to understand is that they may be thinking in the immediate, this is going to affect my academic, no. We can and have. I need you to understand this. We can and have done many things for kids when it comes to their academic stuff. Whether it's freezing grades, eliminating tests, getting rid of projects or quizzes, so that that variable is now gone from the equation. So we can focus on what do we need to do to keep you safe for now, and how do we help get you the support and structure going forward. So those are things we can do.
That's good to know. My daughter's
Yeah. But the catch on that is not letting that become something of a habitual, right? It's like, okay, I'm really, really stressed. I'm really, really freaked out. I'll close with this story, and it's a great story because of the way it ended. 3 years ago, there was a student that was a senior in SAS who was in my office, and she was freaking out. 20 minutes later, she's on stage singing Christmas songs. And she was freaking out because she said to her parents, I don't care what kind of mental health issues I have, I just have to get into. And she listed a Ivy League school. Freaking out. Fortunately, her parents said, you know, we do care. We do care. And we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that you're safe and getting the supports. Well, for her, that was her first acknowledgement that she had some mental health issues that she was trying to sort out and work through. Between Christmas and spring, she focused on those things. And you know the amazing thing that happened? She got the help and the support that she needed, and she got into that school, and she chose not to go to it. Because she recognized this cost is going to be way too much. Way too much. To which I say to her parents, bravo. She ended up going to another school that was smaller, better suited for the structures and the supports that she wanted to pursue, and she's there and doing quite well right now.
So how did she carry on that emotional support into the college? Did her parents contact the counselors?
Yeah. Yeah, so when she left for university, the parents made sure that she had the supports and structures for counseling services available to her. Yeah. And it didn't preclude her admission to the school. It wasn't something that she had to put out ahead of time, like, not only do I have this SAT score, but I also have this other issue that I'm dealing with. That's information that does not need to be shared. It's not contingent upon acceptance into the school. But I was so proud of her because she recognized, look, I could be in this particular school, but the cost is way too high. I mean, if I had to perform this way to get in, and I have to do this for the next, why? What am I doing to myself? That's incredible maturity for a young 17, 18-year-old kid. And I really, really commend her for that. Thank you for your time this morning.